The next one is a true Bitcoin legend. Now, let me ask you one thing. Who knows what transaction pinning means? Raise your hand. Okay, not many. Well, for the others, we are about to find out, because the next speech is called Transaction Pinning and Layer 2. Please welcome Peter Todd.
Thanks for having me on. I'm going to ask you again, so what small part of the audience knows what transaction pinning is? Stick up your hands. All right, maybe 1, 2. I'll give it 6. How about that? So yeah, I've been involved in Bitcoin core development for a while. I've been done just enough to get sued by Craig Wright. It's a very low bar, but something I've worked on lately is looking at transaction pinning and L2 systems and so on. And I really want to go start with what's the motivation for here? I mean, why did this topic come up? And what you're looking at there is from mempool.space, and it happens to be a Lightning commitment transaction that I found in their mempool that has been sitting around for a month. And back in the day, early on in Lightning's history, I think there's this kind of assumption that mempools were not very full, fees were low, and you could kind of ignore this stuff. And it certainly was true that, maybe back in like 2018, even 2019, if you paid, a couple sats per V-byte, you certainly would wind up in the next block. But that's no longer true. This particular transaction, at least according to Mempools.space, they saw it a month ago, and it's still unconfirmed. And an issue there is, well, at some point, you may be in a situation when these multi-party protocols where something never gets confirmed, and potentially someone can lose money from that. Because there's a lot of games you can kind of play with this. The other issue, too, is that in a multi-party protocol, there's more than one party who's participating in these transactions. They might have incentives for things to happen in ways that you may not. One possible incentive may be, hey, if your transaction, if the way you want it to be confirmed never gets confirmed, maybe they can do something else that rips you off. Because ultimately, Lightning is a protocol where, your counterparty can do things to screw you over, and you're supposed to be able to react to that. And, I gave another version of this talk where I went into more detail about the nuances of this, but I think for this audience, the key thing you got to remember is sometimes you want to get things confirmed, and you got to do it in a timely manner. And with that, I also want to talk a bit about mempools and miners. As I'm sure a lot of you people out in the audience, and frankly, I'm guilty of this myself sometimes, will use the phrase, the mempool. The mempool is not how it works. Every single one of you who runs a Bitcoin node, you have a mempool running on your node. Your nodes are connected to other nodes, and all that your mempools are doing is just exchanging data, exchanging Bitcoin transactions. And the whole purpose of this is that eventually these transactions get to miners, miners put into blocks, and then you have the blockchain. Well, why is it the blockchain versus the mempool? Because the blockchain is the thing that we actually have consensus over. Mempools are just part of that process of creating consensus. Which also gets the question of, well, what transactions get into the blockchain from various mempools? And you may have heard the term replaced by fee. And I think a simple way to go think about it is, surely if there are two different transactions that conflict, surely miners are going to mine the one that has more money involved, right? More dollar signs is good. And that's sort of true, but not always true. And when it's not always true, that's really what transaction pinning is about. Transaction pinning is a series of economic exploits against miners that prevent profitable transactions from being mined. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I might be trying to close out a Lightning channel, put something on chain, and a transaction pinning attack would be my counterparty finding a way to stop my transaction from getting mined. I'm willing to pay miners a market rate. I'm willing to pay them enough money that's in their incentive to stick my transaction in the block they create. In a transaction pinning attack, my counterparty is finding a way to stop that happen, not by mining something else, but by putting something in Mempools, including miner Mempools, that prevents my transaction from getting into the next block. Well, what's a simple example of a transaction pinning attack? Well, we used to have, and we kind of still do have, this way of turning transaction replacement off. And this gets termed as full RBF. Now, I don't know how many of you guys waste your time on Twitter, but you may have seen the Twitter battles over the years over whether or not we should do full RBF. And I think that's kind of become a moot topic, given essentially 100% of miners will replace any transaction, provided it pays more money. You know, this flag that kind of used to be relevant that could turn that off, it's no longer relevant at the mining level. And you know, if you run a Bitcoin node, you may have heard this term, mempool full RBF equals 1. That's the config file, the config setting you set to allow transaction replacement to happen on any transaction. And for protocols like Lightnings, CoinJoins, et cetera, where there's multiple entities in one, that are involved in potentially one transaction, full RBF is an important step because it ensures that there is no direct way, at least, to jam a transaction to make sure that something doesn't get confirmed. Of course, this is the first part where I start disagreeing with Bitcoin Core people, which is a bunch of them wanted to go remove this option, which, it is what it is, and there's kind of some politics involved there, and I have my own pull request to enable this by default so that all your nodes would just have this behavior, but, that is what it is. Politics be politics. But the harder part to fix with transaction pinning is a more subtle exploit. And here is a mempool display screenshot again. And that is, you're looking at a display of what would be in the next block. And I want to point out that this process is kind of like an auction system. I kind of imagine it as a bunch of guys selling cattle. Now, an interesting question is, let's suppose I'm at a cattle auction. And I rock up to the auction and say, you know what? I'm willing to go buy 10,000 cows for $1 each. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen a cow, but it looks like it's worth more than $1. And I'm sure the rest of the people at the auction are just going to laugh at me. You're an idiot. No one's ever going to sell you 10,000 cows for $1 each. And surely in an auction, I would then be able to update my bid and say, you know what? That was stupid. Instead, I'm going to go and sell, or I'm going to go buy, say, 1 cow for $1,000. Now, 1 cow for $1,000, that sounds about right. And you would expect in a normal auction, that bid would go through, or at least be considered. That's not actually how the mempool auction works. We'll go back a second. So, there we go. So, when miners are creating blocks, it's kind of like an auction in that their incentive is to sort the transactions by fee rate. What transaction pays the most money per byte? Because remember, a block is a fixed size, right? You have 1 megabyte, basically speaking, it's a bit more complex, but basically speaking, 1 megabyte to go fit. You make the most money by fitting it with highest fee rates. The problem is, our rule, which is this whole BIP 125 rule, says that once you've made a bid, you can never reduce the total value of your bid, even though your bid is completely uneconomical. Like I say, it's like the cattle auction example, but how do you update your bid? And that's the main transaction pinning thing. But also, I should point out, transaction pinning isn't just about L2. It also affects things like CoinJoins. It affects something called SigHash anyone can pay, which allows multiple people to contribute inputs to a transaction. And also, interestingly, it affects consolidation transactions. Like if you're an exchange and have a whole bunch of UTXOs and want to go and turn those thousands of UTXOs into one, your incentive is to do this all the time, right? To always give miners the option, hey, if fees get low enough, please help me out here. But because of transaction pinning, you won't be necessarily able to go and send a bit of that money to someone else because the total fee paid in the transaction would have gone down. So, what's Bitcoin Core doing? Well, Bitcoin Core is working on this thing called V3 transactions, which is a very narrow type of fix to try to for things like Lightning, fix transaction pinning by just saying, you know what, let's make the maximum size of a transaction really small. Because if it's really small, this whole bit about how big your bid was doesn't matter, right? The difference between the maximum transaction size and minimum transaction size is small, so if I need to outbid a transaction pinning thing, I don't have to go spend that much. It's a pretty limited thing. None of the other use cases I mentioned in my previous slide get fixed by that, which is why I proposed a pinning fix, which is to fix the auction system ultimately. And replaced by fee rate says, well, why don't we change the code so miners can decide whether or not to replace a transaction, and Mempools in general, based on what the fee rate is. So if you pay a higher fee rate, potentially the transaction will get replaced, and potentially this can wind up in a blockchain. It's much like the way a cattle auction works. I can update my bid. The total value of my bid may be less, but I'm willing to pay more money per cow or more money per byte. And the interesting thing, I think, for the people in this audience is, for various reasons, this has become kind of political. This is A. Chow, and the lead maintainers of Bitcoin. He does not like my idea one bit. Well, whatever. It is what it is. And yesterday I gave a talk going into more detail about all this and kind of how this plays out. But I think what's interesting is that this is an example where a fork of Bitcoin can be relevant. It doesn't matter that he disagrees, because Bitcoin Core isn't the only software out there. People are quite able to go run other things. And I have my own fork of Bitcoin Core called Libra Relay, which happens to implement this replace by fee rate fix. And it also happens to implement code that makes sure Libra Relay nodes are always connected to each other, so that transactions following these rules will actually propagate around to miners. If you run my fix, my code, this type of fix can go happen. If you choose to run Bitcoin Core, other types of fixes go happen. That's fine. We can see which one wins in the end. So finally, I think I'll go talk about, well, how long until pinning is fixed? And also, how relevant is this right now? And I didn't go into a lot of detail about the nuances of the tech, exactly what pinning attacks are out there and how they play out in different things. But lately I've been working on a paper actually going through all the different L2 proposals out there. And you've probably heard of a lot of them. There's ARC, there's all kinds of fancy innovations with Lightning to go have multiple people in one channel, et cetera. There's things like LN symmetry you may have heard about. But the common thread for all this stuff is they all make paying for fees more complex. Because when it's just two people in one channel, it's relatively easy for them to say, hey, here's what fee we're going to go pay. If we got to go pay a different fee, maybe we'll pay a different fee and negotiate. Maybe we'll go and pre-sign some transactions in advance for what fees we might want to pay. It all gets fairly simple. But when you have potentially 1,000 people sharing one UTXO for one Lightning channel, fee payments gets a bunch harder, because there's a lot more things that can happen, a lot more transactions you might have to have floating around in people's Lightning implementation databases and so on. And also, we're kind of looking towards the future. Like I said before, when Lightning was first developed and first implemented, fee payment was a simple thing, and fees didn't matter that much. Now we're starting to have to look at things like, hang on a second, maybe in certain situations, your Lightning payment that's in progress, the transactions that it represents, maybe they're not actually economical to mine. Maybe the outputs that represent aren't economical to mine. And there's a lot of work we have to do to go through all these cases and figure out when these situations make sense game theory-wise. And that's also where this pressure to go fix transaction pinning is. And I'll give you an example early on. If you looked closely in that commitment transaction, you might have seen how there were 4 outputs. You might ask the question, well, why do we need 4 outputs for a Lightning channel that is 2 people? Like, in Lightning, the trick is that we take the money in some multi-sig pot, and we split it up across the people in the channel. Well, why are there 4 outputs? Why aren't there just 2? Why can't Alice and Bob just split the money 2 ways? Well, that gets down to the nuance of how do we go pay fees. Those things are called anchor outputs, which we use to go pay fees by making yet another transaction. Those anchor outputs, they're the type of thing that transaction pinning is relevant to. That's where V3 comes in. That's where all this complexity comes in. But how long till pinning is fixed? Well, interesting thing is some of this stuff's partly fixed. The fact that we have 2 Lightning anchor outputs is actually part of a transaction pinning fix. It says Alice has an output, Bob has an output. They're signed, so now it's harder for Alice to screw over Bob and vice versa with a transaction pinning attack. Well, we'd like that to be 1 output, which makes it easier for one party to screw over the other. But once we go fix that, we can make Lightning transactions a little smaller, which saves money on fees, which ultimately uses less block space and ultimately lets us have more Lightning channels. But V3 transactions, that's currently part of that code is in Bitcoin Core. And depending on how things go, that'll probably get shipped in the next version, probably later this year. My own replace by fee rate fix, because Libra relay nodes already exist in production, for a lot of cases, this is actually fixed. Not because miners run my code, but rather because mempools aren't in consensus. If you go broadcast replace by fee rate double spend, there's a good chance it's going to get to a miner who's dropped a transaction away from their particular mempool. And then the replacement will get mined, and we're all good. I'm also talking to, I'm not going to say who, but talking to some big miners, and they think, depending on how their testing process go on, they might have this fix in place later this year. They're always a little vague about it, because frankly, I'm pretty damn low on their priority lists. They want to go and make money on inscriptions and whatnot mainly, but maybe this will get implemented. We'll see. And maybe more people will come up with more ideas. We'll have to go see how that plays out. And like I say, currently Lightning seems reasonably well prepared for this. So everything I just talked about is really what's coming down to the future. And speaking of the future, well, I guess I have to leave and get on to the next panel. But hopefully you'll hear more about the stuff in the future. Maybe not too much. We don't want any disasters. But for that, thank you.